Sometimes the things we find in the quiet places change us forever. Sometimes they change everything. Cambria Thorne spent years walking the mountain trails alone, searching for traces of the past in abandoned mines and forgotten camps. She knew these woods like old friends, so when she spotted that rusted container half buried in the lake mud, she thought she'd found another piece of history. Inside was a compass that wouldn't stop pointing north, journals with dates from the future, and a strange light that shouldn't exist. Then people started vanishing near the water. The old folks in town locked their doors and spoke in whispers about things best left alone. Now that container hums louder every night, and Cambria knows something is waking up. What was it meant to do? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story speaks to you, subscribe, because tomorrow brings something special. The cabin sat at 7,200 feet, tucked into a fold of granite and pine where the morning sun arrived late and the evening shadows came early. Cambria Thorne had chosen this place 6 years ago for exactly that reason. The world moved slower here, gave a person time to think, time to heal from wounds that weren't the kind you could see. She'd built her life into a comfortable rhythm. Mornings began with coffee on the porch, watching mist rise off the lake that stretched out below like a mirror catching the sky. The water was deep, fed by snowmelt and underground springs that kept it cold even in August. Local folks called it Mirror Lake, though the old survey maps labeled it something else, Lake Terrence. After some forgotten prospector who drowned there in 1889, Cambria knew these mountains the way a sailor knows the sea. Every trail, every abandoned shaft, every rotted timber marking where men had once dug for silver and gold and copper, chasing dreams that mostly ended in disappointment. She'd made it her business to document what remained, sketching old structures, photographing equipment left to rust, mapping the veins of ore that had drawn people here a century ago and then let them down. Her work wasn't romantic. It was methodical, scientific, the kind of labor that required strong legs and a stronger back. She'd haul 50 pounds of surveying equipment up slopes that would wind a younger person, spend hours taking measurements and soil samples, then return home to update her maps and notes. The State Geological Survey paid her a modest stipend for the data. It was enough. The cabin itself was simple but well maintained. One large room served as kitchen and living space, with a wood stove that could heat the whole place when winter arrived. Her bedroom was small, just enough for a bed and a dresser. The third room, the one she'd added herself, was her workshop. Shelves lined the walls, filled with rock samples, old mining tools she'd collected, reference books on geology and metallurgy. A workbench dominated the center, scarred from years of use, tools hanging in precise order on pegboard above it. She was 36. Though people in town sometimes guessed older, the sun and wind had weathered her face the way they weathered everything up here. Her hands were calloused, her shoulders strong from years of physical work. She kept her dark hair cut short for practicality. And her clothes were functional, denim and flannel, good boots that could handle rough terrain. The town of Pinehaven lay 8 miles down the mountain road, small enough that everyone knew everyone, but not so small that people felt the need to pry. Cambria made the trip twice a week for supplies and mail, sometimes less in winter when the road became impassable. Vernon Slate ran the general store, a weathered man in his late 60s who'd lived in Pinehaven his entire life. He had the kind of memory that made him a local historian by default. He could tell you which family had owned which property going back 3 generations, who'd married whom, which businesses had failed and why. He treated Cambria with the same courteous distance he afforded everyone, asking after her work but never her personal life. Find anything interesting up there? He'd ask while ringing up her groceries. Old sluice gate near the Patterson claim, she might answer. Still intact, surprisingly. Cedar construction, probably 1890s. He'd nod, genuinely interested. Vernon appreciated anyone who treated the mountain's history with respect. The postal carrier was Mrs. Kowalski, a widow in her 70s who drove the rural route 3 days a week. She had kind eyes that held old sadness, the kind that had settled in and made itself at home. Her husband had disappeared 20 years ago, went fishing at Mirror Lake one morning, and never came back. Search parties had combed the area for weeks. They'd found his truck, his tackle box on the shore, but no body, no explanation. Weather treating you well up there? Mrs. Kowalski would ask when she handed over mail. Can't complain, Cambria would reply. Saw a black bear last week, good size. Eating berries down by the creek. You be careful, the older woman would say. The same gentle warning she offered every time. Then there was Deputy Sam Rourke, mid-30s, relatively new to the area, only 5 years, which by local standards made him practically a visitor. He was competent and earnest, the kind of lawman who took his responsibilities seriously without being overbearing. He'd stop by Cambria's place occasionally, ostensibly to check that everything was all right, though she suspected he was just curious about her solitary life. Most people can't handle this much quiet, he'd said once. Standing on her porch and looking out at the vast silence of trees and stone. Most people don't try, she'd answered. That had been true of her once too. 6 years ago, she'd been engaged to a man in Denver, working for a mining consulting firm, living a life that looked successful from the outside. But it had felt like wearing someone else's clothes, nothing quite fit right. The engagement had ended badly. One of those situations where two people realize they'd been trying to build something on sand. She'd walked away from all of it, the job, the city, the whole carefully constructed future, and found her way to this cabin through a combination of research and instinct. The mountains had given her what she needed: solitude without loneliness, purpose without pressure. She'd discovered that she could be good at this life, maybe better than she'd been at the other one. The compass had been the first thing she'd noticed when she opened the container. It lay atop the other objects, a brass instrument that showed its age, green patina in the crevices, the glass face cracked in a spiderweb pattern. But when she'd picked it up, the needle had swung north with absolute certainty, that decisive pull of magnetic alignment. She turned the compass east. The needle swung back to north, turned it south. The needle returned to north. She'd walked 100 yards away, rotating the compass in every direction. The needle never wavered, never showed the slightest deviation. It pointed north with the kind of certainty that made her skin prickle. That wasn't how compasses worked. The needle should follow magnetic north, regardless of how you held the casing. This one seemed to point to true north, or something it had decided was north, completely independent of the Earth's magnetic field. She'd brought it back to the cabin that first day, spent the evening examining it by lamplight. The craftsmanship was excellent. Hand-tooled brass, tiny screws holding the mechanism together. There were symbols etched along the rim, geometric patterns she didn't recognize. No manufacturer's mark, no date, nothing to indicate where or when it had been made. She'd placed it on her workbench, aligned it carefully with her surveying compass. Her compass showed true magnetic north, adjusting for the local declination she knew by heart. The mysterious compass pointed 15 degrees different, not magnetic north. Not true north, but something else entirely. What disturbed her most was that it never drifted, never showed the tiny fluctuations that all magnetic instruments displayed. It was locked onto its bearing with absolute precision, as though the needle wasn't responding to magnetism at all, but to something else, some force or direction she couldn't measure or understand. She'd tried everything she could think of. Brought it near strong magnets, no effect. Enclosed it in a steel box, the needle remained steady. Took it 2 miles away to a different elevation, still pointing the same direction. By the time she went to bed that first night, she'd developed a theory that made no sense. The compass wasn't pointing to a direction at all. It was pointing to a location, a specific place, and would continue to do so regardless of where she took it. That should have been impossible. That was impossible. Yet there it sat on her workbench, its cracked face catching lamplight, its needle absolutely still. The journals had been underneath the compass, wrapped in oilcloth that had partially failed. Water had seeped in, damaging many of the pages, making them fragile and difficult to separate. She'd left them alone that first night, focusing on the compass instead. The light source was the third object, and the strangest. About the size of her palm, smooth metal that might have been aluminum or something lighter. No seams, no battery compartment, no switch or button she could find. Yet it glowed with steady white light, bright enough to read by, emitting no heat whatsoever. She'd held it under running water, still glowing. Wrapped it in a blanket, light shone through. Left it in a closed drawer overnight, found it still. Illuminated in the morning, whatever powered it was beyond anything in her. Experience, battery technology couldn't produce that kind of sustained output without heat dissipation. Solar cells needed light to charge. This thing simply glowed, indefinitely, with no apparent energy source. The three objects sat on her workbench now, 2 days after the discovery. She'd told no one about them. Wasn't sure what she would say if she did. The container itself remained where she'd found it, half submerged in the lake mud. She'd tried to move it that first day, but it was heavier than it looked. Wedged into the bottom in a way that suggested it had been there a long time. The door hung open at an angle, just as it had when she'd first seen it. She'd examined the metal, steel, heavily rusted, probably 60 or 70 years old. There were no markings on the exterior, no shipping labels or identification numbers. Just a box that had found its way to the bottom of her lake and stayed there until something, erosion, shifting sediment, pure chance, had exposed it. She sat at her workbench now, the afternoon sun slanting through the window, and stared at the three impossible objects. The compass pointed its unchanging direction. The light glowed without heat or power. The journals waited to be read, their water-damaged pages holding who knew what information. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a sound like distant water. A raven called from somewhere up the slope. The world continued in its familiar patterns, but something had shifted. She'd brought these things into her home, and now they sat here like a question she didn't know how to answer. Cambria reached for the journals, carefully separating the first few pages. The handwriting was precise, old-fashioned, written in fountain pen that had bled in places where water had touched it. She could make out a date at the top of the first entry, August 15th, 1988. She stopped, read it again. August 15th, 1988. It was currently June of 1987. The date in the journal was more than a year in the future. She set the journal down, stood up, walked to the window, took a long breath. Looked out at the lake, where the container sat, visible from here as a dark shape near the shore. Then she returned to the workbench and kept reading. The dawn came cold and clear. Cambria had barely slept, her mind turning over those impossible dates. She'd spent half the night working through the journals, trying to separate pages without tearing them, reading what she could by the light of the strange device. Most entries were mundane. Weather observations, notes about wildlife, descriptions of the lake, but all dated in the future. Some from 1988, others from 1989, a few claiming to be from 1990. The handwriting changed between entries, suggesting multiple authors, though there was no indication who any of them were. She'd made coffee before sunrise, then gathered equipment, camera, notebook, measuring tape. Whatever was happening, she needed more information. The walk to the lake took 15 minutes on the trail she'd worn through years of use. The morning air smelled of pine sap and cold water. Duck startled from the reeds as she approached. The container sat exactly where she'd found it, door still hanging open. In morning light, she could see more detail. Steel, heavily corroded, with pitting suggesting decades of exposure. The hinges were frozen with rust. She photographed it from multiple angles, then waded into shallow water to examine the sides and bottom. Roughly 4 feet long, 3 feet wide, 2 feet deep. Reinforced corners suggested it had been built for transport. No markings, no serial numbers, nothing to indicate origin. She took measurements, sketched the position, noted water depth and sediment type. All the methodical documentation she would normally do for any find. Then she noticed something that made her stop. Cold, The container had moved. She was certain, absolutely certain, when she'd found it 2 days ago. The door had faced northeast. She'd noted it in her sketches. Now the door faced almost due north, rotated maybe 30 degrees. Cambria stepped back. The mud showed no footprints except her own. No drag marks, no signs anyone had physically moved it, yet it had shifted. The angle was wrong. She took more photographs, documenting the current position. Her scientific training demanded rational explanation. Perhaps she'd been mistaken, or the container had settled as water and sediment shifted, but it had been wedged firmly when she'd tried to move it. Now it rested more loosely, as though it had lifted and repositioned itself. Objects don't move themselves. Yet the compass pointed to impossible directions. The light glowed without power, and the journals predicted the future. She needed to tell someone. But who? Deputy Rourke would think isolation had affected her judgment. Vernon would listen politely but dismiss it. Mrs. Kowalski might believe her, but what could an elderly postal carrier do? Cambria returned to the cabin, changed into dry clothes, made a decision. She would go to town, conduct normal errands, and listen. Sometimes the best way to understand something strange was to pay attention to what others had noticed. The drive down took 40 minutes, switchbacks requiring concentration. By the time she reached Pinehaven, it was mid-morning. Vernon's store sat on Main Street, a false front building from the mining days. She parked and went inside, the bell announcing her arrival. Vernon stood behind the counter, helping Mrs. Patterson with groceries. He nodded to Cambria, finished with his customer, then turned her way. "Morning," he said. "Didn't expect to see you midweek." "Ran low on a few things," she said, collecting items, coffee, canned goods, batteries. Things she didn't particularly need, but which gave her an excuse. "Heard about Hamilton Briggs?" Vernon asked, his tone casual but expression concerned. Something cold settled in her stomach. "No, what happened?" "Went missing night before last. Wife called the sheriff when he didn't come home. They found his truck up at the lake, your lake, Mirror Lake. Tackle box sitting on the shore, fishing rod leaned against a tree. But no Hamilton. Night before last, the same night she'd discovered the container, she set down the can she'd been holding. Did they find any sign of him?" "Search party looked all yesterday. Nothing. Like he walked into the water and didn't come back." Vernon shook his head. "Hamilton's been fishing that lake 40 years. Knows every inch. Doesn't make sense." Cambria's mind raced to the journals. Had there been mention of someone named Hamilton? She couldn't remember. They still searching? Called it off this morning. Sheriff says if a body's in the lake, it'll surface eventually. Vernon's expression said what he didn't. A man could die from exposure up there. His wife must be devastated. Betty's holding up. Got family with her. Vernon rang up her purchases. "You be careful up there, hear? Maybe don't go down to the lake alone for a while." "I'll be careful," she promised. Outside, the sunlight seemed too bright, too ordinary. She put groceries in the truck but didn't get in. Instead, she walked to the small library, a converted house serving the community's modest needs. The librarian was Pauline, a woman in her 50s, who ran the place with quiet efficiency. "Cambria," she said, looking up. "Don't usually see you on a Thursday." "Research question," Cambria said. "You have old newspapers on file? Local news from previous years?" "We've got the Pinehaven Gazette going back to 1952 on microfiche." "What are you looking for?" "Anything about disappearances at Mirror Lake? Any incidents over the years?" Pauline's expression shifted. "This about Hamilton Briggs?" "Just curious about the history." "The lake's been there a long time. Wondered if anything like this happened before." The librarian led her to a small room in back where the microfiche reader sat. "You know how to work this?" "I'll figure it out." Pauline brought film canisters, organized by year. "You need anything, just holler." Cambria spent 2 hours scrolling through decades of local news. The Pinehaven Gazette covered town meetings, high school sports, social announcements. But scattered through the years were other stories. 67. Local man missing after fishing trip. Joseph Kowalski's disappearance. Mrs. Kowalski's husband. Same lake, same circumstances. Truck found, fishing gear present, no body. 51. Search continues for missing couple. Two people vanished while camping near Mirror Lake, tent intact, food in the cooler, but they were gone. 43. Hunter fails to return. Man had gone into woods near the lake. Never seen again. The pattern went back further than the archives. Each disappearance shared elements: proximity to the lake, no signs of struggle, no bodies found. The articles treated them as tragic accidents, but Cambria saw differently. She saw a pattern spanning decades, centered where she'd found the container. She made copies of relevant articles, thanked Pauline, returned to her truck. The journals were in her cabin, waiting to be read more carefully. She needed to check those dates. The drive back felt longer. Her mind kept returning to Hamilton Briggs, to his wife waiting at home, to search parties finding nothing. He'd been taken. Somehow she knew this with certainty that bypassed logic. The container, the artifacts, the disappearances, they were connected. The cabin was exactly as she'd left it, journals still on her workbench. She spread them out carefully, working through fragile pages with patience, usually reserved for delicate specimens. There, in an entry dated July 1987, last month, a single line in careful script. Hamilton taken during evening fishing. Pattern continues as predicted. Her hands started shaking. She set the journal down, walked to the window, tried to process what she was reading. These weren't predictions. They were records. Someone had documented events before they happened. She forced herself to keep reading, piecing together information from damaged pages. More names, more dates, some in the past. Joseph Kowalski, the couple from 1951. Others in the future, people who would disappear in coming months if the journal proved accurate. Then she found her own name. The entry was dated September 12, 1987, 3 months from now. The page was partially water-damaged, but she could make out enough. Cambria Thorne, interference noted, decision point approaching. The rest was illegible. She sat down heavily. Whatever was happening, she was part of it now. The journal had predicted her involvement, or perhaps her discovery of the container was the interference mentioned. Outside, afternoon light was fading. The lake was visible from her window, that dark expanse that had seemed peaceful for 6 years. Now it looked different, dangerous, full of secrets people had died not knowing. The compass sat on her workbench, still pointing its impossible direction. The light still glowed. The journals held more information, more warnings she needed to understand. The most pressing question wasn't in the journals. It was outside, in that container that had moved when it shouldn't have. What was it? Where had it come from? And what did it want with the people it took? Cambria stood, gathered her coat and flashlight. The sun would set in an hour. She had time to return to the lake, examine the container once more before darkness came. She needed answers, and she had the terrible feeling that the only way to get them was to keep investigating, even though the journal warned her interference was noted. Someone, or something, was watching. And now that she'd opened that door, she couldn't pretend she hadn't seen what was inside. 3 days passed in focused documentation. Cambria had set up her workshop like a research lab. The 3 artifacts arranged on her workbench, alongside notes, photographs, and copied newspaper articles. The journals lay open, weighted with rocks to keep fragile pages flat. She'd been studying the light source with systematic precision. First external observation. She'd measured it at 3 inches diameter, perfectly circular, half an inch thick. The surface was seamless, smooth as polished glass, but with the cool touch of metal. Then testing. She'd submerged it in water for 12 hours. No effect on the light, no corrosion. Frozen it in her icebox overnight. It glowed steadily at 15 degrees below zero. Wrapped it in layers of insulation. The light penetrated through. Temperature readings showed constant coolness, regardless of ambient conditions. No heat signature at all. Light required energy. Energy generated heat. Yet this device produced brilliant illumination with no thermal output. She'd tried to open it, searching for seams or access points. Nothing. The surface appeared to be a single piece, as though cast or grown rather than assembled. Her notes were extensive, clinical, the kind she would submit to the Geological Survey. But they all pointed to the same conclusion. This technology didn't exist in 1987. The knock on her door came late morning on the third day. She'd been so absorbed that the sound startled her. Visitors were rare, especially unannounced. Deputy Rourke stood on the porch, uniform crisp despite mountain heat. "Morning, Miss Thorne. Got a minute?" "Of course." She stepped aside, but positioned herself to block view of her workbench. The artifacts were partially covered, but journals were visible. Rourke didn't try to enter further. He was respectful that way. "Wanted to ask if you'd seen anything unusual around the lake recently. Any people you didn't recognize? Disturbances. This about Hamilton Briggs?" "Yeah, following up on everything." "You spend time near the water, thought you might have noticed something." Cambria considered telling him everything. But what would she say? Journals predicting the future. A metal box that moved itself? "I saw his truck when I was down there a few days ago," she said, which was true. Didn't think much of it. "People fish there all the time. Did you see Hamilton? Any sign of him?" "No, just the truck." Rourke made notes in a small pad. "You been down to the lake since?" "This morning, checking erosion patterns near the north shore. Notice anything out of place?" She thought about the container's new position. "Nothing specific. Why?" "We found unusual markings in the mud. Geometric shapes, almost like someone drew patterns." "Mean anything to you?" Her pulse quickened. "What kind of patterns?" "Circles, lines, triangles. Look deliberate, but doesn't make sense. Could be natural formation. Maybe kids messing around." He studied her face. "You're a geologist. Any explanation?" "I'd have to see them. Natural formations can look geometric, crystals, dried mud cracks. Would you mind taking a look?" "Help us rule out anything scientific," she agreed, more to see what he'd found than to help. They drove down in his patrol car, neither speaking much. The lake stretched before them, serene in midday sun. Rourke parked where Hamilton's truck had been, found and led her along shore to a section about 50 yards from the container. The markings were exactly as described, geometric patterns, pressed into exposed mud at the waterline. Circles within circles, straight lines radiating like spokes, interlocking triangular forms that seemed intentional. Cambria crouched, examining closely. Not natural. The lines were too precise, too deliberately arranged. But they weren't fresh. Edges had begun to blur, suggesting they'd been there at least a few days. "These were here before Hamilton disappeared?" she asked. "Can't say for certain. Didn't notice them during the search. One of the volunteers spotted them yesterday. She photographed them with her camera, capturing scale and arrangement. The patterns reminded her of symbols etched on the compass, though not identical, more like the same language in a different dialect. Could be surveying marks," she offered weakly, "though I don't recognize the convention." "Surveying for what?" "I don't know. Maybe mapping the lake bottom, documenting depth variations. Reference points." Rourke didn't look convinced, but nodded. "All right. Thanks for taking a look. If you think of anything or see anyone who doesn't belong, give me a call. I will." He left her there. She watched his car disappear, then returned attention to the markings. The sun had shifted, and now she could see faint traces of the same patterns extending into shallow water. She waded in, following the lines, realized they formed a path leading directly to where the container sat. Not random, not natural. These were markers pointing to her discovery like arrows on a map. She spent an hour documenting everything, taking measurements, sketching patterns. When finished, she looked at the container itself. In bright daylight, it seemed almost ordinary, just a rusted box in lake mud. But she knew better. That evening, back at the cabin, she spread new photographs beside the journals. She worked through water-damaged pages, searching for reference to geometric symbols. She found it in an entry dated August 1987, next month. Different handwriting, more angular, markers appearing according to schedule. Circle nearly complete. Collection zone established? Collection zone. The phrase made her skin crawl. She kept reading, piecing together fragments. The pattern was disturbing. Symbols appeared in sequence, forming a perimeter around a specific lake area. Once the perimeter was complete, collection would begin. Hamilton Briggs had been first. The journal suggested there would be more, at least 6 additional disappearances over coming weeks. All within the marked zone, all following a schedule someone had planned. The light device on her workbench continued its steady glow. She'd been keeping it covered during day, uneasy about constant illumination. Now she uncovered it, studying the smooth surface. On impulse, she brought it close to the compass. The moment they came within 6 inches of each other, something changed. The compass needle, locked in its unchanging direction, suddenly began to spin. Not randomly, but deliberately, making 3 complete rotations clockwise. Then stopping precisely at north, the light device pulsed once. Brief intensification. Then returned to normal. Cambria set both artifacts down quickly, heart racing. They had reacted to each other. These weren't separate objects. They were part of a system, components that recognized each other's presence. She'd thought she was investigating a mystery. Now she realized she was looking at technology, engineering far beyond anything she understood. The container, the artifacts, the geometric markings, all deliberate, purposeful, part of something larger. The question was, what was the purpose? What was being collected and why? The journals might hold more answers, but so many pages were damaged. She needed better information before the next disappearance occurred. According to the entry she'd found, the next person would vanish in 4 days. A teenage boy who liked to fish from the eastern shore. The entry didn't give a name, just described him. Tall, 17, wore a blue baseball cap. She could warn people, tell Deputy Rourke about the predictions. But without proof, without explaining how she knew, she'd sound delusional. The only proof she had were the artifacts. And she was increasingly certain that revealing them would be dangerous, not just to her investigation, but to her life. The journals mentioned interference noted. Someone was aware of her discovery. Night had fallen while she worked. Through the window, she could see the lake below, moonlight reflecting off its surface. Somewhere down there, the container waited, and around it geometric markers were appearing according to schedule. She made a decision. Tomorrow she would map the entire marked area, document every symbol, establish the perimeter of this collection zone. If she understood the boundaries, maybe she could find a way to disrupt the pattern, prevent the next disappearance. It was inadequate against forces she didn't understand, but it was better than doing nothing while people vanished. She extinguished the lamp and lay down, though sleep would be difficult. The light device glowed softly, its illumination casting shadows on the ceiling. The quiet mountain life she'd built had been an illusion. This place had never been safe. People had been disappearing from Mirror Lake for decades, and she'd been living above it, unaware. Now she knew, and knowing meant she had to act. The midnight air was cold enough to see her breath. Cambria stood at the lake's edge, flashlight in one hand, notebook in the other, documenting geometric symbols that had appeared along the shoreline. She'd waited until after dark to begin this survey, unwilling to risk questions from anyone passing during daylight. The patterns were more extensive than Deputy Rourke had realized. His search party had only noticed obvious markings, those pressed deeply into mud at the waterline. But Cambria, methodically working around the lake's perimeter, had found dozens more. Some were faint, barely visible even in direct light. Others had been marked with small stones in precise configurations. Together, they formed a circle, approximately 300 yards in diameter. Centered on where the container sat, she photographed each symbol cluster, noting its position on her survey map. The work was painstaking, requiring her to wade through cold water, scramble over rocks, push through dense vegetation. But years of prospecting had taught her patience and thoroughness. By 2 in the morning, she'd completed nearly half the circuit. Her fingers were numb, clothes soaked from wading, but the pattern was undeniable. Someone had marked this territory with deliberate precision, creating a boundary that encompassed a specific section of lake. She was crouched over a particularly complex symbol arrangement when she heard movement behind her. Not an animal. The footsteps were too regular, too purposeful. Human Cambria turned slowly, flashlight illuminating a figure standing 30 feet away at the tree line. An elderly man, probably in his 70s, wearing pajamas and a bathrobe that hung open. His feet were bare, scratched from walking through forest. He stared toward water with an expression both blank and intensely focused, like someone sleepwalking, but with terrifying determination. "Sir?" Cambria called softly. "Are you all right?" He didn't respond, didn't acknowledge her. He took another step toward water, then another. She recognized what was happening. This was what the journals described. The calling, the compulsion that drew people to the lake before they disappeared. Cambria moved quickly, intercepting him before he could reach the water's edge. She grasped his arm gently but firmly. "Sir, you need to stop. You shouldn't be here." The moment she touched him, he jerked as though waking from a dream. He blinked, looked around in confusion, then down at his bare feet and pajamas. Where am I?" His voice was rough with sleep and bewilderment. "You're at Mirror Lake, about 2 miles from the nearest road. Do you remember how you got here?" He shook his head, trembling now. "I was in bed. I was asleep. I remember." He paused, expression troubled. "I remember hearing something. Like voices, but not voices. Like singing maybe, but the words weren't words. What did the voices say? I don't know. I couldn't understand them, but they were calling me. I had to come. I had to." He looked at the water, and for a moment his expression became distant again. Cambria tightened her grip. "What's your name?" "Howard." "Howard Finch." The name seemed to anchor him, pull him back from whatever trance had gripped him. "Howard, I'm Cambria. I live up the mountain. We need to get you home." "Where do you live?" "Pine Haven. Oak Street, the blue house near the church." He looked down at himself, seemed to fully register his state. "My God, I walked all the way out here in my sleep." "Something like that. Come on. My truck's about a 1/4 mile up the trail. Can you walk?" He nodded, though he leaned on her for support as they made their way back. His feet were in bad shape, cut and bleeding from the rough terrain. She helped him into the passenger seat of her truck, gave him a blanket she kept in the back. "How long have you been hearing the voices?" she asked as she started the engine. 3 nights now." Howard pulled the blanket tight around himself. "Started soft, like whispers in a dream. Tonight they were so loud I couldn't ignore them. I got out of bed and just started walking. Didn't even think about shoes or a coat. Just had to get to the water." Cambria's alarm grew. This matched the pattern described in the journals. Those who disappeared heard something summoning them, growing stronger each night until they couldn't resist. "Have you told anyone about this?" "Your doctor, maybe." "Thought I was losing my mind. I'm 74. Figured it was dementia starting." He looked at her with frightened eyes. "But it's not, is it? It's real. Something's calling people to that lake." She didn't answer directly. "Did you know Hamilton Briggs?" "Sure. We worked together at the railroad for 30 years. Why?" "He went missing from the lake a few days ago." Howard's face went pale. He'd been complaining about bad dreams. Said he kept hearing something at night, couldn't make out what. I thought he was joking. His voice dropped to a whisper. "That's what got him, isn't it? Whatever I was hearing tonight, I don't know yet. But I'm going to find out." She drove him home, helped him to his door. His wife answered, shocked to see him in such condition. Cambria explained he'd gotten disoriented during a night walk, left out the details about the calling. Howard caught her eye as she turned to leave, gave a small nod of understanding. Back in her truck, Cambria sat for a moment before starting the engine. She'd just saved Howard Finch from whatever fate had claimed Hamilton Briggs. But the journals suggested more would come. More would hear the calling. She couldn't be everywhere, couldn't save everyone. She needed to understand the mechanism, find a way to stop it at the source. The drive back up the mountain took her past Vernon's store, dark and closed at this hour. Past the church where Mrs. Kowalski attended services every Sunday. Past the small homes where people slept, unaware that something was systematically calling them to the water. Dawn was breaking when she reached her cabin. She was exhausted but knew she couldn't sleep yet. She had to check the journals, see if they mentioned Howard Finch by name, confirm whether saving him had changed anything. The entry was there, dated for tonight. Howard Finch called. Expected collection at 0300 hours. Expected collection. The clinical language made her sick. But there was something else, a notation in the margin, added in different ink. Subject diverted. Interference confirmed. Adjustment required. Her hands trembled as she read those words. Someone was updating the journals in real time, noting her intervention. The interference mentioned in her own entry wasn't just about finding the container. It was about her active opposition to whatever was happening. She'd crossed a line tonight, moved from observer to participant. And whoever was orchestrating this now knew she was working against them. Cambria stood, walked to the window. The sun was rising over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It should have been beautiful. Instead, all she could think about was the notation in the journal. Adjustment required. What did that mean? Would they accelerate the timeline? Change targets? Come for her directly? She returned to her workbench, spread out all her documentation. The photographs of geometric symbols, the survey map showing the collection zone, the newspaper articles about past disappearances, the journals with their impossible predictions. She was one person, alone in the mountains, facing something she didn't fully understand. But she'd learned something crucial tonight. The calling could be interrupted. People could be pulled back from whatever compulsion drew them to the water. If she could understand how the calling worked, maybe she could find a way to block it entirely. The artifacts might hold the key, the compass, the light source, perhaps even the container itself. She picked up the compass, studied it in the morning light. It still pointed in that unchanging direction, locked onto something she couldn't see. What if it wasn't pointing to a location at all? What if it was pointing to the source of the calling, to whatever was generating that irresistible summons? An idea formed. If she followed the compass's direction, if she tracked it to wherever it was pointing, she might find answers. It would mean leaving the lake, leaving the immediate area where disappearances occurred. But staying here documenting patterns wasn't enough. She needed to go to the source. The decision crystallized. Tomorrow, today really it was already morning, she would gather supplies and follow the compass north. See where it led. Find what it was pointing to. But first, she needed to warn the town. Even if they didn't fully believe her, she had to try. She would go to Deputy Rourke, tell him about the calling, about Howard Finch's experience. Urge him to keep people away from the lake, especially at night. If she disappeared following the compass, at least someone would know what she'd been investigating. At least her documentation would remain. Evidence for whoever came looking. She changed into clean clothes, made coffee, ate a quick breakfast. By the time she headed down the mountain again, the town was waking up. She could see smoke rising from chimneys, early risers beginning their day. Deputy Rourke was at the sheriff's office, looking tired. Probably hadn't slept much with an open missing persons case. Miss Thorne, he said, surprised to see her. Something wrong? I need to tell you. Something about the lake, about what might be happening to people. His expression shifted from surprise to concern. Come in. Let's talk. Cambria sat across from Deputy Rourke in the small office, choosing her words carefully. She couldn't tell him everything, not about the journals predicting the future or the artifacts that defied physics. But she could tell him about the calling, about Howard Finch, about the pattern she'd discovered. I found Howard Finch at the lake last night, she began. Around 2 a.m. He was walking toward the water in his pajamas, bare feet, looked like he was in some kind of trance. Rourke leaned forward. Is he all right? I drove him home. His feet were cut up, but otherwise he's fine. The thing is, he told me he'd been hearing voices for 3 nights. Said they were calling him to the water, getting stronger each night until he couldn't resist. Voices. Rourke's skepticism was evident, but not dismissive. What kind of voices? He couldn't describe them exactly. Not words, not language he recognized. Just a compulsion, an overwhelming need to get to the lake. She paused. He said Hamilton Briggs had complained about bad dreams, about hearing something at night. Right before he disappeared, that got Rourke's attention. His expression grew serious. You think there's a connection? I think people are being drawn to that lake by something they're hearing. I think that's why there are no signs of struggle, no evidence of what happened to them. They go willingly because they can't help themselves. What would cause that? Some kind of... He struggled for a rational explanation. Gas leak? Carbon monoxide? Something environmental making people disoriented. I don't know what's causing it, but I've been researching the lake's history. There's a pattern of disappearances going back decades. Always the same circumstances. Always near the water. Always no bodies recovered. Rourke pulled out a notepad. You have documentation of this? She'd brought copies of the newspaper articles. She spread them on his desk. 1967, 1951, 1943, and others. He read through them slowly, his expression growing more troubled. Why didn't anyone notice this pattern before? The disappearances are spread out over years. Different sheriffs, different deputies. No one was looking at the long view. I only found it because I was specifically searching the archives. And the geometric markings we found, you think they're related. I think someone knows what's happening at that lake. I think those markings are deliberate. Maybe warnings, maybe... She stopped herself before saying markers for a collection zone. Maybe survey points for whoever's behind this. Rourke stood, walked to the window. This sounds crazy. You know that, right? But Hamilton Briggs is still missing, and what you're describing about Howard Finch, that's a clear safety issue. He turned back to her. What do you think I should do? Keep people away from the lake. Post warnings. Patrol the area at night. And if anyone reports hearing strange sounds or feeling compelled to go there, take it seriously. I can increase patrols. Put up some caution signs. But if I go to the sheriff, saying people are hearing voices that draw them to the water, he's going to think I've been up here in the mountains too long. Then don't tell him about the voices. Tell him you're concerned about the geometric markings, about evidence of suspicious activity. Tell him you want to secure the area while investigating Hamilton's disappearance. He considered this. That might work, but what about you? You've been spending a lot of time at that lake. If there is something dangerous going on, I'll be careful. Actually, I'm planning to be away for a few days. Following up on some research? What kind of research? She'd prepared for this question. Historical records. There's an archive up in Cascade that might have more information about the area's mining history. Thought I'd check if there were any unusual incidents documented from the early days. It wasn't entirely a lie. She was following a lead, just not to any archive. She was following the compass to wherever it pointed. Rourke wrote something in his notepad. All right. I'll set up patrols starting tonight, and I'll talk to the sheriff about securing the area. He looked at her directly. You find anything in those archives, anything that might help, you call me immediately. Understood. Understood. She left the sheriff's office feeling marginally better. At least someone in authority knew about the danger, even if they didn't understand its full scope. If anything happened to her, Rourke would keep investigating. Her next stop was Vernon's store. She needed supplies for the journey, food that wouldn't spoil, water, a better flashlight, batteries. As she gathered items, Vernon watched with curiosity. Stocking up for a trip? He asked. Few days of field work. Might be out of reach for a while. This about Hamilton? She glanced at him. Why would you ask that? You've been asking questions, poking around the library. Deputy came by earlier, asked if I'd noticed anything unusual at the lake. Doesn't take much to connect dots. Vernon's expression was kind but concerned. Whatever you're looking into, be careful. These mountains don't give up their secrets easily. I'm always careful. That's what Joseph Kowalski used to say. That's what Hamilton said. Vernon bagged her purchases. You remind me of someone who lived here years back. Woman named Alice Drummond, geologist like you. She got interested in the lake, started researching disappearances. One day she packed up her stuff and said she was following a lead. Never came back. The name wasn't in any of the newspaper articles she'd read. When was this? 1973, 14 years ago. Vernon's eyes held old sadness. Found her truck abandoned up a logging road about 20 miles north of here. No sign of her, no explanation. Sheriff figured she got lost in the woods, but he shrugged. I always wondered if she found something she shouldn't have. 20 miles north. The same direction the compass pointed. Cambria felt a chill run through her. Did Alice leave any notes? Any documentation of what she was researching? If she did, it's long gone. Her family came, took her belongings, never came back to Pine Haven. But I remember she was excited about something in those last few days. Said she'd figured out a pattern, that she knew where to look. The pattern. The same pattern Cambria had found in the journals, in the historical disappearances. "Thank you for telling me," Cambria said quietly. "Just want you to come back. That's all." Vernon's voice was gentle. "This town's lost enough people to that lake." She promised to be careful, loaded her supplies into the truck. But as she drove back up the mountain, Alice Drummond's story circled in her mind. Another researcher, another person who discovered the pattern and followed it north. Another disappearance added to the long list. The journals had mentioned interference noted when describing her involvement. Had they mentioned Alice too? Had someone been tracking her investigation, noting her progress, waiting to see what she would do? Back at the cabin, Cambria spread out her survey map. She marked the lake, marked the geometric symbols forming the collection zone. Then she took the compass, held it steady, and used her surveying tools to plot its bearing on the map. The line extended north, through miles of wilderness, past the logging roads, into some of the most remote territory in the region. She traced the route with her finger, calculating distances, identifying landmarks. Whatever the compass was pointing to, it was at least 25 miles away, maybe more. 2 days of hiking through rough terrain, possibly 3 if the going was difficult. She began packing systematically. Camping gear, warm clothes, first aid kit, her documentation sealed in waterproof cases. The artifacts went into a specially padded bag. She wasn't leaving them behind. They might be needed wherever she was going. The journals she wrapped carefully and hid in a lockbox under a floorboard in her workshop. If she didn't return, someone would eventually find them. They'd have evidence of what was happening, even if they didn't understand it all. As the sun set, she stood on her porch one last time, looking down at the lake. It seemed peaceful in the fading light, giving no hint of the darkness beneath its surface. Tomorrow at dawn, she would leave. Follow the compass north. Find whatever it was pointing to, whatever had drawn Alice Drummond into the wilderness 14 years ago. She wasn't naive about the danger. The journals had warned about interference. Vernon had told her about Alice's disappearance. Everything suggested this was a trap, a path that led to the same fate as all the others, but she couldn't stop now. Too many people had vanished. Too many families lived with unanswered questions. If there was even a chance she could find answers, could stop whatever was taking people from this mountain. She had to try. The compass sat on her kitchen table, its needle pointing north with absolute certainty. Tomorrow, she would follow where it led, into the wilderness and whatever waited there, for tonight she would rest. Tomorrow, everything would change. Dawn came with frost on the grass. Cambria loaded her pack into the truck, double-checked her supplies. The compass sat in her shirt pocket, its steady presence a reminder of the journey ahead. The light source she'd secured in a padded case, along with her documentation and the most intact of the journals. She drove north on the main highway for an hour, then turned onto a logging road that hadn't seen much use in recent years. The truck bounced over ruts and washouts, branches scraping against the sides. After another 30 minutes, the road became impassable. This was as far as vehicles could go. She parked, shouldered her pack, and checked the compass. Still pointing north, but now she could follow it on foot, let it guide her through the wilderness. The first day of hiking was hard but familiar work. She'd done plenty of backcountry prospecting, knew how to read terrain, how to find the easiest path through dense forest and rocky slopes. The compass's bearing took her through old-growth timber, across small creeks, around steep ravines. By midday, she'd covered 8 miles. The landscape had changed. Fewer signs of human activity, no trails, no old mining claims. This was true wilderness, the kind of country where a person could disappear without anyone ever finding them. She stopped for lunch beside a creek, studying the compass while she ate. The needle had never wavered. Not once in all the hours of hiking. Whatever it was locked onto was straight ahead, somewhere in this vast expanse of mountains. The journal she'd brought made for grim reading during her rest. She'd chosen the one with the most legible entries, hoping to find more information about what she was walking toward. Most entries were observational, notes about weather, wildlife, geological features. But scattered among them were other entries, more disturbing ones. One passage dated 6 months in the future from now described collection efficiency improving and transport mechanism stable. Another mentioned subject integration at 92% without explaining what that meant, but it was the map in the back that held her attention. She'd noticed it before but hadn't studied it carefully. Now, cross-referencing with her own survey map, she realized something crucial. Every location marked on the journal's map, every place where the container had appeared over the past 150 years, was on a precise geometric grid. Not random placements, but calculated points forming a larger pattern across North America. The lake where she'd found the container was just one node in an extensive network, and at the center of that network, where multiple grid lines converged, was a point she estimated to be about 15 miles ahead of her current position. The compass was pointing directly to it. She photographed the journal map, made notes, then packed up and kept moving. The afternoon brought her into rougher country, steep slopes covered in scree, dense thickets of mountain laurel, areas where she had to detour around impassable terrain. By evening, she'd covered another 6 miles. She made camp in a small clearing beside a rock outcrop that offered some shelter. As she set up her tent, she noticed something odd, marks on the rock face. Not natural weathering, but deliberate scratches forming geometric patterns, the same patterns she'd seen at the lake. Her pulse quickened. She photographed them in the fading light, compared them to her documentation from the collection zone. Identical symbols, same precise arrangement. Someone had been here, marked this location. She was on the right track. That night, she sat by her small camp stove, warming her hands, thinking about Alice Drummond. Had Alice found these same markers? Had she followed the same trail, getting closer to the center of the network with each mile? Vernon had said Alice's truck was found 20 miles north of Pine Haven. Cambria was now roughly 18 miles out. She'd be passing through Alice's last known location sometime tomorrow. The thought was sobering. She checked her emergency beacon, a device that would send a distress signal if she activated it. Deputy Rourke knew she was in the field. If she didn't return in 4 days, he'd start looking. But would he know where to search? She'd left a sealed envelope with Mrs. Kowalski to be opened if she didn't return. Inside was a map showing her planned route, along with copies of the most important documentation. It wasn't much, but it was something. The forest around her was quiet, except for wind in the trees and the occasional call of an owl. She'd spent countless nights alone in the wilderness, but this felt different. The markers on the rock, the journal's ominous entries, the knowledge that she was walking towards something that had been pulling people to it for over a century, it all weighed on her. She pulled out the light source, let its steady glow illuminate her small camp. No heat, no battery, just constant illumination. Whatever technology created this was so far beyond 1987 that it seemed almost magical. Almost, but it wasn't magic. It was engineering, purpose-built technology that served a specific function. The compass, the light, the container, the geometric markers, they were all components of a system. A system designed to do what? Collect people, according to the journals. But collect them for what purpose? Morning came cold and clear. Cambria broke camp efficiently, checked the compass, and continued north. The terrain grew steeper, forcing her to scramble over rock faces and push through dense vegetation. But the markers appeared with increasing frequency, scratches on trees, stones arranged in patterns, symbols carved into exposed bedrock. She was getting close. Around midday, she found the truck. It was tucked into a ravine, hidden from casual view, slowly being reclaimed by forest. Vines grew over the hood, rust covered the panels, and small trees had sprouted nearby. But the basic structure was intact. She approached carefully, photographed it from multiple angles. The license plate was barely readable under the corrosion, but she could make out enough. Registered in 1973, Alice Drummond's truck. The driver's door opened with difficulty, hinges seized with rust. Inside, the cab had been picked clean by time and animals. No personal effects, no notes, nothing to indicate what had happened to Alice. But on the dashboard, barely visible under years of grime, someone had scratched symbols. The same geometric patterns from the lake, from the rock faces, from the journal maps. Alice had been documenting them too, right up until the end. Cambria felt a wave of sadness. Alice had been like her, a geologist, a researcher, someone driven to understand the mystery. And she'd walked this same path, followed this same trail, gotten this close to answers before disappearing. She wouldn't let that happen to herself. She checked her beacon again, made sure it was functioning, took detailed photos of the truck and its location. If nothing else, Alice's family would finally know where she'd ended up. Then she kept moving north. The compass pulled her onward for another 3 miles. The markers became more frequent, more elaborate. No longer just simple scratches, but complex arrangements of symbols that seemed to form a kind of language or notation system. And then, as she crested a ridge, she saw it, a clearing in the dense forest, roughly circular, maybe 200 feet across. The ground was bare, no vegetation, no undergrowth, just exposed dirt and rock. And scattered throughout the clearing were objects, metal containers, like the one at the lake. Dozens of them. Some were partially buried, some sat on the surface, some were stacked on each other. They varied in age, some heavily rusted like hers, others appearing much newer. Their metal still relatively clean, but all of them were positioned in a precise geometric pattern, forming concentric circles around a central point, and at that central point was something else entirely. A structure partially visible above ground that looked nothing like the rusted containers. This was sleek, metallic, clearly advanced technology. Parts of it were buried, but what she could see suggested something much larger underground. The compass in her pocket was vibrating now, a sensation she'd never felt before. The needle was spinning rapidly, no longer pointing in one direction, but rotating continuously. She'd found it. The source. The center of the network, and standing at the edge of the clearing, watching her, was a person. The man was in his 60s, wearing outdoor gear that looked expensive and well-maintained. He stood perfectly still, hands visible at his sides, non-threatening in posture but clearly positioned to block her easiest path into the clearing. "Ms. Thorne," he said, his voice calm and measured. "We've been expecting you." The use of her name sent ice through her veins. She'd suspected she was being watched, but hearing confirmation was different. She kept her distance, hand moving toward the emergency beacon in her pack. "I wouldn't activate that," the man said, noting her movement. "We're too far from any response team. And besides, you came here looking for answers. I can provide them. Who are you?" "My name is Dr. Marcus Webb. I'm what you might call a coordinator for the positioned." He gestured toward the clearing. "We maintain the network you've been investigating. We ensure the beacons function properly. We document the collections." Cambria's mind raced. "The positioned, the group mentioned in the journals. You're the ones taking people." Taking is such a crude word. "We facilitate necessary relocations." Webb's expression remained neutral, as though discussing routine administrative work. "The beacons mark collection zones. People within those zones who meet certain criteria are selected for transport. Transport where? Why? Those are complicated questions, with answers you might not be ready to understand." He took a step toward her, and she immediately stepped back. He stopped, held up his hands. "I'm not going to harm you. In fact, harming you would defeat the entire purpose of this conversation." "What conversation?" "I didn't come here to talk to you, but you came here nonetheless, following the compass exactly as we knew you would." Webb's smile was slight, almost sad. "You were selected for observation 3 months ago, Ms. Thorne. Not as a collection target, but as a potential recruit. We've been watching your investigation with great interest." The implication hit her like a physical blow. "You planted the container for me to find. We positioned it where someone with your skills and habits would discover it. The artifacts inside were carefully chosen, interesting enough to intrigue you, functional enough to validate the technology, documented enough to lead you here." He gestured to the clearing again. Everything has been orchestrated to bring you to this moment. Cambria felt her reality tilting. The discovery that had seemed like chance, the investigation she'd thought was her own choice, all of it had been manipulated. Why? Because the positioned needs people like you. Intelligent, methodical, capable of understanding complex systems. We're not a large organization. We can't be, given the nature of our work. We select carefully, test thoroughly, and recruit only those who demonstrate the necessary qualities by letting them think they're investigating murders, by watching while people disappear. The collections serve a necessary function. I can't explain that function to you yet, not until you've had time to process what you're seeing here. But I can tell you that every person taken through the beacons is alive, healthy, and serving a purpose greater than anything they would have accomplished in their previous lives. Hamilton Briggs, Joseph Kowalski, Alice Drummond. They're all alive. Webb nodded. Alice was particularly promising. She made it this far just as you have. Unfortunately, she wasn't ready for the truth. She tried to run, tried to destroy one of the beacons. We had no choice but to collect her as well. You took her because she wouldn't join you. We took her because she'd seen too much and couldn't be trusted. But you're different, Ms. Thorne. You're still here, still listening, still asking questions instead of running or attacking. That shows judgment, control, qualities we value highly. Cambria forced herself to think past the shock. She needed information, needed to understand what she was dealing with. Show me proof. Prove to me that the people you've taken are alive and well. Webb considered this. I can show you the facility, but that would mean entering it. Once you go inside, you can't leave until you've made a decision. Join us, or join the collected. There's no third option. Not anymore. That's not proof. That's a threat. It's reality. The moment you followed that compass to this location, you crossed a threshold. We can't have someone with your knowledge walking free, potentially sharing what you've learned. So yes, it's a choice. Become part of the positioned. Help us maintain the network and understand its true purpose, or become one of the collected yourself. His tone softened slightly. But I promise you either way, you'll survive. You'll continue. The only question is, in what capacity? Her hand was still near the emergency beacon. She could activate it now, send out a distress signal. But Webb was right. They were too far from any help. By the time anyone arrived, she'd be gone. I need time to think. Of course. I'll give you until sunset. That's, he checked his watch, approximately 4 hours. Explore the clearing if you like. Examine the beacons. Just don't attempt to damage anything or leave the immediate area. There are others watching, and they won't be as patient as I am. Webb walked away, disappearing into the trees on the far side of the clearing. Cambria stood frozen for a moment, processing everything she'd just learned. It had all been a setup. The container positioned where she would find it. The artifacts selected to intrigue her. The journals documenting just enough to lead her here, but not enough to warn her away. Even saving Howard Finch had probably been calculated, showing her that intervention was possible, encouraging her to feel like she had agency when really she was following a script someone else had written. She wanted to be angry, but the emotion that came strongest was a deep, aching disappointment. She thought she was investigating a mystery, uncovering truth. Instead, she'd been a subject in someone's experiment, but they'd made a mistake. They'd shown her the clearing, the beacons, the structure at the center. They'd confirmed that the positioned was a human organization, not some supernatural force. And humans made mistakes, had limitations, could be opposed. She had 4 hours. Cambria moved into the clearing carefully, documenting everything with her camera. The containers were arranged in 7 concentric circles, each circle containing 12 containers. 84 beacons total, each marking a collection zone somewhere in North America. The structure at the center was partially exposed, maybe 20 feet of it visible above ground. It was cylindrical, made of metal that looked like brushed steel, but somehow felt different, smoother, almost organic in texture. There were no visible seams, no doors or windows she could see from this angle. She approached it cautiously, expecting someone to stop her. No one did. Up close, she could see symbols etched into the metal, the same geometric patterns from the lake, from the journals, from Alice's truck. But here they were more elaborate, forming complex arrangements that seemed almost like circuit diagrams. The ground around the structure was clear of vegetation, the dirt packed hard, as though nothing would grow there. She knelt, took a soil sample, noticed it was warm to the touch despite the cool air. The structure was generating heat, pushing it into the surrounding earth. That meant active technology, power sources, systems running underground. This wasn't a monument or marker, it was functional, operational. Her examination was interrupted by a sound, metal scraping on metal. She turned to see a section of the structure sliding open, revealing an entrance. A woman emerged, younger than Cambria, maybe late 20s. She wore simple grey clothing, her expression neutral. "Dr. Webb said you could see the facility if you wanted," the woman said. "I'm here to escort you inside. Who are you?" "My name is Stephanie. I was collected from Seattle 2 years ago. Now I help maintain the network." She gestured toward the opening. "The facility is actually quite impressive. You'll understand more once you see what we're doing. And if I don't want to go inside, then you wait here until sunset and make your decision without full information. But I think you're too curious for that. You came all this way. You might as well see what's at the center of the mystery." She was right, and they both knew it. Cambria had spent her entire adult life seeking answers to geological puzzles, historical questions, scientific mysteries. Walking away now without seeing what was underground, without understanding the full scope of what she'd discovered, it would violate everything she was, but it would also mean stepping into their trap, giving up her freedom of movement, potentially her freedom to choose. She thought of Deputy Rourke, of the envelope she'd left with Mrs. Kowalski, of all the documentation she'd hidden back at her cabin. If she disappeared here, they'd know she'd been investigating. They'd know to look at the lake, to question the positioned. Her death or collection wouldn't be meaningless. "How long do I have inside before I have to decide?" "As long as you need. Time works differently in the facility. You could spend days exploring and learning, and only hours would pass outside. That should have been impossible. But then again, so were journals that predicted the future and lights that glowed without power. Cambria made her decision. She had to know, had to understand. Even if it meant walking into danger. "All right," she said. "Show me." Stephanie smiled, genuinely, as though pleased rather than victorious. "Follow me. And Ms. Thorne, try to keep an open mind. What we're doing here is much bigger than you think." They entered the structure together, the metal door sliding shut behind them, with a sound like finality. The corridor descended at a gentle angle, walls smooth and featureless, except for subtle lighting that seemed to emanate from the metal itself. The air was temperature-controlled, comfortable, with a faint hum that Cambria felt more than heard. "The facility extends roughly 300 feet underground," Stephanie explained as they walked. "What you're seeing is human-built infrastructure integrated with much older technology. The original structure has been here for approximately 12,000 years. Cambria stopped walking. "That's impossible. That's what I said too. But you'll see the evidence soon enough." Stephanie's tone was matter-of-fact, as though she'd had this conversation many times. "The Positioned didn't create the beacon network. We discovered it, learned to operate it, and have been maintaining it for the past 2 centuries. They reached an elevator, or what looked like one. The doors were seamless metal, opening silently at their approach. Inside there were no buttons, no controls visible. The doors closed and Cambria felt gentle downward movement. 12,000 years, Cambria said, testing the idea. That would put this structure in the late Ice Age. There was no civilization capable of building something like this. Not human civilization, no. Stephanie met her eyes. "That's the part that takes the longest to accept." The elevator stopped. The doors opened onto a vast chamber that made Cambria's breath catch. It was enormous, easily 200 feet across, the ceiling lost in shadows high above. But what dominated the space were the pods. Hundreds of them, arranged in precise rows, each one roughly the size of a person. They were transparent, and through the material Cambria could see people inside. Sleeping or something like sleep. Are they alive? She whispered. Very much so. Come closer. You can see for yourself. Cambria approached the nearest pod, her hands trembling. Inside was a woman, probably in her 40s, eyes closed, chest rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. Sensors attached to her temples, her wrists pulsed with soft blue light. What are you doing to them? Teaching them, Stephanie said. Or rather letting them learn. The pods facilitate knowledge transfer, language, mathematics, history, technical skills. When they wake, they'll know things they never studied, understand concepts they never encountered in their previous lives. Why? Because they're being prepared. The Beacon Network isn't about collection for its own sake. It's about recruitment for a much larger project. Stephanie walked between the rows of pods, gesturing as she spoke. The original builders left this facility as a kind of automated system. It was designed to gather specific individuals, people with certain cognitive patterns, certain potential, and train them for eventual contact. Contact with whom? The builders, or their descendants? We don't know exactly. The facility's interface is partially functional, but large sections remain locked to us. What we do know is that it's been running this program for millennia, systematically collecting and preparing humans according to criteria we only partially understand. Cambria felt dizzy. The scale of what Stephanie was describing was overwhelming. The position, you're just maintaining something you found. You don't control it. We influence it. We can designate collection zones, activate or deactivate certain beacons. But the core systems? Those are beyond our full understanding. We're caretakers, not creators. Stephanie stopped in front of a particular pod. This is Hamilton Briggs. He was collected 6 days ago. He's currently learning advanced mathematics and theoretical physics. When he wakes in another month, he'll be changed. Better in some ways, more capable. He didn't consent to this. No, none of them did. That's the moral complexity the positioned struggles with. Stephanie's expression showed genuine conflict. We facilitate collections we don't fully control, preparing people for a purpose we don't fully understand. Because we believe the alternative, letting the system run completely unsupervised, would be worse. Worse how? Come with me. I'll show you. They walked to the far side of the chamber, where a wall of screens displayed data Cambria couldn't interpret. Stephanie touched one screen, and it changed to show a map of North America covered in glowing points. These are all the beacon locations, past and present. See how they form a grid. She touched another control, and lines appeared connecting the points. This grid has been slowly expanding for centuries. New beacons activate, new collection zones appear, the network grows. Growing toward what? We believe it's reaching a critical threshold. When enough beacons are active, when enough people have been collected and trained, something will happen. The facility will complete its primary function, which is, we don't know. But we've found references in the partial translations we've managed, something about returning the prepared and opening the way. Best guess? The people in these pods are being made ready for some kind of mass activation. They'll wake up, and they'll know what to do, even if we don't. Stephanie pulled up another screen, this one showing numerical data. Collections have been accelerating over the past 50 years. What used to take decades now takes months. The system is approaching some kind of completion point, and when it gets there, everyone in these pods will wake up at once. Exactly. 847 people, all of them changed, all of them trained for purposes we can't predict. If that happens without human supervision, without anyone understanding what they're meant to do or how to guide them. She didn't finish the sentence. Cambria walked along the rows of pods, seeing faces she recognized from the newspaper articles. The couple from 1951, younger than their photos but unmistakably them. Joseph Kowalski, Mrs. Kowalski's husband, still appearing to be in his 50s, despite 20 years passing above ground. And there, 3 rows back, Alice Drummond, the geologist who'd investigated this same mystery 14 years ago. You said Alice tried to destroy a beacon. What happened to her? She was collected like all the others. Dr. Webb gave her the same choice he gave you: join the positioned or enter the pods. She chose to fight instead. Stephanie's voice was sad. She damaged one beacon before we could stop her. That beacon had to be taken offline for repairs, which meant the collection zone it serviced went dormant. Dozens of people who should have been collected over the following years weren't. We don't know what impact that had on the system's timeline. Good. She disrupted your schedule. Maybe, or maybe she delayed something that was meant to happen on time, and now the consequences will be worse. Stephanie touched the pod, holding Alice. She was brilliant, brave, passionate about protecting people, just like you. That's why Dr. Webb wanted to recruit her. That's why he wants to recruit you. I'm not joining an organization that kidnaps people. Then you're choosing the pods. Stephanie's voice hardened slightly. I need to be clear about this, Miss Thorne. Dr. Webb gave you 4 hours to decide, but the moment you entered this facility, the clock stopped mattering. You've seen too much. You know where we are, what we're doing, how the system works. We can't let you leave with that knowledge unless you're part of the positioned. Then you're no better than the system you claim to supervise. You're just as guilty of taking people's freedom. Yes, we are. Stephanie met her eyes without flinching. Every member of the positioned carries that guilt. We take people from their lives. We facilitate a process we don't fully understand. We make choices about who gets collected and who doesn't. It's terrible. It's necessary. And it's the burden we accept because someone has to manage this, and we're the ones who discovered how. Cambria felt trapped. Every direction led to impossible choices. Join an organization that kidnapped people, or become one of the kidnapped. Fight and likely fail, or surrender and lose herself. But there was still information she needed. Still pieces of the puzzle missing. The artifacts I found. The compass, the light source. What are they? Interface devices. They allow limited interaction with the beacon network. The compass points to network nodes. The light source can activate dormant beacons if you know the proper sequence. There are others. Communication devices, diagnostic tools, control mechanisms. The positioned has collected dozens over the years. And the journals? Written by positioned members. We document everything. Collections, beacon activations, system behaviors. The journals you found were deliberately left in the beacon for you to discover. We wanted you to see the pattern, to follow the trail here. So you could trap me, so we could offer you a choice. Stephanie gestured around the chamber. This facility is going to complete its function soon. Within the next 5 years, maybe less. When that happens, these 847 people will wake up and they'll do whatever they've been programmed to do. Don't you want to be there when it happens? Don't you want to understand what all of this has been for? It was a seductive argument, Cambria had to admit. The chance to witness something unprecedented, to understand a mystery that spanned millennia. But at what cost? I need to see more. I need to understand the system better before I can make any decision. Dr. Webb thought you'd say that. Come on, there's something else you should see. They took a different elevator, ascending this time. They emerged in a smaller chamber, this one dominated by a single large screen. Dr. Webb was there, along with 2 other people Cambria didn't recognize, an elderly woman and a young man, both wearing the same neutral gray clothing as Stephanie. Miss Thorne, Webb said. I'm glad you're still open to learning. What I'm about to show you will help contextualize everything you've seen. He touched the screen, and it displayed an image that looked like a star map. This is what we've managed to decode from the facility's archives. It's a location, a solar system roughly 40 light-years from Earth. We believe that's where the builders came from. The image zoomed in, showing a planet. They visited Earth during the last ice age, built this facility and the beacon network, then left. We don't know why, but they left the system running, collecting humans according to specific criteria, training them, preparing them. For what? Best guess? To serve as intermediaries. When the builders return, and we believe they will return, that's what the opening the way references mean. They'll need humans who can communicate with both species, who understand both cultures. The people in the pods are being made into translators, ambassadors, bridge builders. You're guessing, Cambria said. You don't actually know any of this. You're right. We're inferring from partial data. But consider the alternative, that we understand nothing, that we're maintaining a system we can't predict or control, that we're facilitating something that could be dangerous to humanity. Would you prefer that truth? Cambria stared at the screen, at the image of that distant planet. 12,000 years ago, something had come to Earth and built this facility, had set in motion a process that had been collecting humans ever since, preparing them for purposes that remained mysterious, and she was standing in the middle of it, being asked to join the group that managed it all. I want to see the control systems, she said. I want to understand what the positioned can actually do, what influence you really have. Webb smiled slightly. That's the response of someone who's seriously considering joining us. Come on, I'll show you the interface. They walked deeper into the facility, through corridors that became progressively stranger, the walls showing symbols that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them, the air carrying scents that had no source, the lighting that responded to their movement in ways that felt almost alive. This was the truly alien part of the facility, Cambria realized. The human infrastructure ended, and what remained was whatever the builders had left behind. Webb stopped at a door that opened at his approach. Inside was a room centered around a pedestal, displaying a complex three-dimensional interface. Glowing symbols floating in mid-air, responding to touch and gesture. This is how we control the beacons. It took us decades to learn even this much. Most of the system remains locked, but we can activate collection zones, set parameters, designate timing. He demonstrated, touching a symbol that expanded into a detailed map showing beacon locations. Show me how to deactivate a zone, Cambria said. Webb glanced at her. That's a test. You want to see if I'll show you how to undo what the position does. If you want me to trust you, show me you trust me. He considered, then manipulated the interface. It's complex, but the basic principle is this. He showed her a sequence of gestures that made several symbols in the interface dim. That would put a beacon into dormancy. It would stop collecting, stop calling people to it. And you could do this to any beacon in the network? Theoretically. But it would disrupt the system's timeline, potentially delay whatever completion sequence it's following. The builders designed this to function on a specific schedule. Interfering with that schedule could have consequences we can't predict. Cambria studied the interface, memorizing the gesture sequence. What if the system shouldn't complete? What if the best thing for humanity is to shut it all down? Then 847 people stay in those pods forever, never waking, never living again. Their families never get answers, and we'll never know what the builders intended, what gift or transformation or opportunity they were offering. Webb's voice was intense. I know the position's methods are questionable. I know we've hurt people, separated families, made terrible choices, but we're trying to shepherd humanity through something unprecedented. We need people like you to help us make better decisions. It was persuasive. It was also manipulation. Cambria knew that, could see the careful way Webb was framing everything to make joining seem like the moral choice. But she'd learned what she needed to learn. She knew how the interface worked, knew the gesture sequence to deactivate beacons. And she'd seen the pods, seen that the people inside were alive, could potentially be awakened. I need time to think, she said. Alone, Webb nodded. Of course. Stephanie will show you to a private room. Take all the time you need. When you're ready to give your answer, just tell her. As Stephanie led her away, Cambria's mind was already working. She had maybe one chance to do something meaningful here. One opportunity to disrupt the position's plans, to free the people in those pods, to shut down the system that had been stealing lives for centuries. It would mean betraying the trust Webb had shown her. It would mean risking her own life, but it was the right thing to do. She was certain of that. She just had to figure out how to do it before they realized what she was planning. The private room was small but comfortable. A bed, a desk, basic amenities. Stephanie left her there with a promise to return in a few hours. The door had no visible lock, but Cambria had no doubt she was being monitored somehow. She sat on the bed, forced herself to breathe slowly, to think methodically. She'd spent her career solving problems through careful observation and logical deduction. This was no different, just more complex, with higher stakes. The interface room was the key. If she could access it again, use the gesture sequence Webb had shown her, she might be able to shut down multiple beacons simultaneously. That would disrupt the position's operations, buy time for authorities to investigate before the system could be reactivated. But she'd need to act quickly. Once she made her move, they'd stop her if they could. She thought about the pods, about all those people trapped in artificial sleep. Webb claimed they could be awakened, but he'd also said the system operated on a specific timeline. What if shutting down beacons prevented proper awakening? What if her interference condemned them to permanent suspension? No, she couldn't think like that. The positioned had been making those same justifications for years, using fear of unknown consequences to rationalize continuing their operations. Someone had to take a stand, even if the outcome wasn't certain. Cambria stood, examined the room more carefully. The walls were the same smooth metal as the corridors, but there was a ventilation grate near the ceiling. She pulled the desk chair over, climbed up to examine it. The grate was secured with screws, standard Phillips head. She searched the room, found nothing that could serve as a screwdriver. But the metal bed frame had decorative elements that might work if she could break one off. She worked quickly but quietly, using her boot heel to loosen a thin metal strip from the bed frame. It took 15 minutes of careful effort, but she managed to free a piece roughly 6 inches long, with a flattened end. Back on the chair, she used the makeshift tool to remove the grate screws. Behind the grate was a ventilation shaft, narrow, but she thought she could fit if she removed her pack and pushed it ahead of her. The question was where the shaft led. It might take her deeper into the facility, into areas where she'd be even more trapped. Or it might connect to other rooms, give her access to areas the position didn't want her seeing. Either way, it was better than waiting passively for Stephanie to return. Cambria retrieved her pack, pulled out the light source artifact. Its steady glow would help her navigate the dark shaft. She also grabbed her camera and the emergency beacon. If things went wrong, she wanted evidence of what she'd found to survive. She climbed back onto the chair, pushed her pack into the shaft, then pulled herself up and in. The space was tight, forcing her to crawl on her stomach, pushing the glowing light source ahead of her. The shaft extended forward for about 20 feet, then branched. Left or right, she had no way to know which direction led where. She chose left, toward what she estimated was the center of the facility. The crawl was claustrophobic, the metal shaft cold against her hands. But the light source illuminated her path, and she could feel air flowing through the system, wherever this led. It connected to other spaces. After another 30 feet, she reached a junction where the shaft opened into a larger vertical duct. She could see other shafts connecting at different levels. This was the facility's main ventilation system, distributing air throughout the underground complex. She listened carefully, voices, faint but audible, coming from below. She couldn't make out words, but the tone suggested conversation, not alarm. They hadn't discovered her absence yet. Cambria worked her way down the vertical shaft, using small ridges and joints as handholds. It was slow going, dangerous in places where the metal was smooth, but she made progress. 2 levels down, she found another horizontal shaft with a grate opening into a room. Through the grate, she could see equipment, computer monitors, control panels, chairs where technicians would sit. The room was empty. She removed this grate as she had the first, slid through the opening, dropped quietly to the floor below. The room was some kind of monitoring station, screens displaying data about the pods, about beacon statuses, about facility systems. And there on a desk, a tablet device showing the same interface symbols she'd seen in the control room. Her pulse quickened. This might be a secondary access point, a way to interact with the system without returning to the main interface chamber. She picked up the tablet, studied the display. The symbols were the same, arranged in similar patterns. She attempted the gesture sequence Webb had shown her, fingers moving across the screen in the specific pattern. The display responded. Symbols dimmed, then brightened again. It had worked. She'd accessed the beacon control interface from here. Now came the crucial part. She needed to shut down multiple beacons, enough to cripple the position's collection network. But which ones? Shutting down all of them might trigger immediate alarms. She needed to be selective, strategic. She brought up the beacon map, studied the glowing points across North America. The lake near her cabin was marked, still active. She used the gesture sequence to deactivate it. The symbol dimmed. Collection zone dormant, she continued, selecting beacons randomly across the network. 10, 20, 30 of them. Each time she completed the gesture sequence, another collection zone went dark. An alarm sounded, a low, pulsing tone that echoed through the facility. She'd been discovered, or the system had detected the mass deactivation. Cambria grabbed the tablet, shoved it in her pack. She had one more thing to do before they caught her. She ran from the monitoring room, following corridor signs toward the pod chamber. She had to reach it, had to find a way to wake the people inside. Hamilton Briggs, Alice Drummond, Joseph Kowalski, all of them deserved to go home, footsteps behind her, voices shouting. She ran faster, her boots echoing on the metal floor. The pod chamber doors were ahead. She burst through them, the vast space opening before her, with its rows and rows of sleeping people. Dr. Webb was there, along with Stephanie and half a dozen other position members. They moved to intercept her, spreading out to block her path. "Ms. Thorne," Webb said, his voice calm despite the situation. "You've deactivated 32 beacons. You've disrupted years of careful scheduling. Whatever you're planning to do next, please reconsider. I'm planning to wake them up. All of them. Send them home to their families? You can't. The awakening sequence is locked to the system's completion timeline. Force an early wake-up and you'll damage them. Cognitively, possibly permanently. They need the full training sequence to integrate what they've learned. You're lying, I'm not. I'm showing you the same truth I've shown everyone who joins the positioned. We're trapped by this system, as much as we control it. We make terrible choices because the alternatives are worse." Cambria hesitated. What if he was right? What if forcing an awakening would hurt the very people she was trying to save? But then she thought about Mrs. Kowalski, waiting 20 years for answers about her husband, about Hamilton Briggs's wife Betty, who'd lost her husband to an evening fishing trip, about all the families who'd been left with nothing but questions and grief. Then I'll destroy the pods. Release them that way. You'll kill them. They're in suspended animation. Their bodies are dependent on the pod systems to maintain basic functions. Destroy the pods, and you murder 847 people. She'd been outmaneuvered. Every choice led to harm. Wake them too early and damage them, destroy the pods and kill them. Leave them and condemn them to continued imprisonment. Unless, Cambria pulled out the emergency beacon, held it up where everyone could see. This device sends a distress signal with GPS coordinates. Every rescue service within 200 miles will respond. They'll come here, they'll find this facility, they'll discover what you've been doing. You'll expose something humanity isn't ready to understand, Webb said. You'll create panic, chaos, probably a government cover-up. The facility will be seized, and the positioned will lose what little control we have. Is that really better? Yes, because sunlight disinfects. Because secrets like this always cause more harm than truth. Because these people deserve justice, and their families deserve answers. She activated the beacon. The response was immediate. The device began transmitting, its signal penetrating through the facility's shielding, reaching towards satellites and relay stations overhead. Webb's expression was resigned. You've made your choice. Now we have to make ours. The positioned members moved toward her, not threateningly but with clear intent. They would take the beacon, would shut it off, would stop her from completing what she'd started. But Cambria had one more card to play. She pulled the tablet from her pack, accessed the interface one final time, and executed a command she'd noticed while examining the system. Emergency awakening sequence. All pods, immediate activation. No! Stephanie shouted. You don't know what that will—" The facility shuddered. Every pod in the chamber began to glow, light pulsing through the transparent material. The people inside stirred, their peaceful sleep disturbed by whatever was happening. Cambria had forced the system's hand. The awakening, Webb said, would take years, had just been initiated in minutes, and she had no idea what consequences that would bring. The pods were opening, all of them simultaneously, their transparent covers sliding back to reveal the people inside. They began to wake, slowly at first, then with increasing awareness. Eyes opening, bodies moving after years of stillness. The positioned members rushed to help, abandoning their attempt to stop Cambria. They moved between the pods, checking vital signs, helping people sit up, speaking in calm voices to those who were confused and disoriented. Cambria stood frozen, watching what she'd unleashed. Had she saved them or harmed them? She wouldn't know until they were fully awake, until she could see whether Webb's warnings about premature awakening had been justified. The facility's systems were changing around her. The gentle hum that had been present since she entered grew louder, more insistent. Lights flickered in patterns that seemed almost communicative. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with energy. "The facility is responding to the mass awakening," Webb said, standing beside her. He wasn't angry. If anything, he seemed almost relieved. "You've triggered the completion sequence. Whatever this place was designed to do, it's doing it now. What does that mean?" "I don't know. We've never gotten this far." The people emerging from the pods were coherent, remarkably so, given what they'd been through. Hamilton Briggs sat up in his pod, looked around with clear eyes, saw Cambria watching. He recognized her. They'd met briefly in Pine Haven before his disappearance. "I know you," he said. His voice was steady, stronger than she expected. "You're the prospector from up the mountain." "Hamilton, yes." "How do you feel?" He considered the question. "Different. I know things I shouldn't know. Mathematics I never studied. Physics that would have seemed like magic a week ago." He looked at his hands. "But I'm me, still Hamilton Briggs. Still remember my wife, my home, my life." Others were waking with similar clarity. Joseph Kowalski, Mrs. Kowalski's husband, emerged from his pod, looking decades younger than he should, but mentally sharp. Alice Drummond woke calming, immediately understanding where she was and what had happened. "Someone forced an awakening," Alice said, looking around the chamber. "Who?" "I did," Cambria admitted. "I'm sorry if I hurt you." Alice stood, tested her legs, found them steady. "You freed us. Whatever else happens, you gave us that." The facility's rumbling intensified. Sections of the ceiling began to retract, revealing sky above. Except it wasn't the sky Cambria had seen when she entered. The color was wrong, the light too bright, the stars visible despite it being daytime. "What's happening?" she asked Webb. "The interface is showing a message. It's been trying to communicate since the awakening began." He pulled out a tablet, similar to the one she'd used, showed her symbols scrolling across the screen. "I can only translate fragments, but it's something about return sequence initiated and transportation authorized." Return sequence. The words from the facility's archives. "The builders are coming, or we're going to them. I can't tell which." The people from the pods were gathering together, helping each other stand, supporting those who needed it. 847 people who'd been taken from their lives, altered in ways they were still discovering. Now standing in this chamber as it transformed around them, the emergency beacon was still transmitting. Somewhere above ground, rescue services were receiving the signal, dispatching teams. But would they arrive in time? And would they find anything when they did? Stephanie approached Cambria, her expression complex. "You destroyed everything we built. 2 centuries of careful management gone in minutes. You were imprisoning people. That needed to end. We were protecting people. From this," Stephanie gestured to the transforming facility, "from triggering something we don't understand. Now we'll all face the consequences together." The chamber floor began to glow with symbols, the same geometric patterns from the beacons, from the journals, from every marker Cambria had found. But these were brighter, more complex, forming arrangements that hurt to look at directly, and then, impossibly, the space around them changed. The metal walls became transparent, and beyond them Cambria could see not the underground earth she knew should be there, but something else. A vast space filled with structures that defied normal geometry, where light moved in patterns that suggested intelligence behind it. "We're not underground anymore," Alice said quietly. "We're somewhere else." A figure materialized in the center of the chamber, not human but not entirely alien either. It was roughly humanoid in shape, composed of light and something else, something that flickered between solid and intangible when it spoke. The words came not as sound, but as direct understanding, translating immediately into thoughts they could all comprehend. "Prepared ones, welcome. The training is complete. The bridge is ready. Will you serve as intermediaries between your species and ours?" The people from the pods, all 847 of them, seemed to understand intuitively what was being asked. Their faces showed comprehension, recognition, as though the knowledge they'd been given had prepared them for exactly this moment. "We will," Hamilton Briggs said, speaking for them all. "We understand what you need from us." The figure turned its attention to Cambria. "Unauthorized one. You forced the sequence before completion. This creates complications. But your interference shows the independence we value in your species. You may choose, join the prepared, or return to your world." Webb stepped forward. "And the positioned. Those of us who maintain the system. Your service is noted. Your choices will determine your role. You preserved what we left, but you also imprisoned those we selected. Balance must be achieved." The facility shuddered again. Through the transparent walls, Cambria could see movement. Other beings like the first, gathering, observing. This was first contact, she realized. Not invasion, not conquest, but invitation. The builders had returned, and they were offering humanity something. Partnership, perhaps, or transformation. "I want to go home," Cambria said. "I want to make sure the families of these people know they're alive, know what happened to them. You may return. But the prepared ones must remain for now. They have work to do here, before they can resume their previous lives. The bridge between species requires time to establish." "How much time?" "Measured in your units, approximately 6 of your months. Then they will return, changed but whole, ready to help both species understand each other." 6 months! It wasn't forever. It wasn't imprisonment. It was service, voluntarily accepted by people who now understood what they were serving. Cambria looked at Hamilton, at Alice, at Joseph Kowalski. They seemed at peace with this, ready to accept their role. "Go," Alice said to Cambria. "Tell our families we're all right. Tell them we'll come home. And tell them," she paused, smiled slightly, "tell them it was worth it. What we're learning here, what we'll bring back. It's worth it." The figure gestured, and a doorway appeared. Not a physical door, but an opening in space that showed the forest clearing where Cambria had entered the facility. "Go now. The authorities your beacon summoned are approaching. Guide them carefully. Not all of your species is ready for this truth." Cambria grabbed her pack, took one last look at the transformed chamber, at the people who would stay behind willingly. Then she stepped through the doorway. She emerged in the clearing just as helicopters appeared overhead, their rotors beating loud in the mountain air. Emergency response teams, Forest Service? Probably federal authorities responding to her beacon's signal. The metal structure at the center of the clearing was glowing, pulsing with the same light she'd seen below. The beacons arranged in their circles were activating, resonating with each other. She raised her hands as armed personnel emerged from the helicopters, showing she was no threat. She had a story to tell them, evidence to share, impossible truths to communicate, and somewhere below or beyond. She wasn't sure anymore. 847 people were beginning work as humanity's bridge to something greater. The debriefing took 3 days. Federal agents, scientists, military personnel, they all wanted to hear Cambria's story, examine her evidence, understand what had happened in that facility. She told them everything, showed them the artifacts she'd brought back, shared the photographs and documentation she'd compiled. Most didn't believe her. The official report would likely classify the incident as some kind of sophisticated hoax or mass hallucination. But a few, the ones who'd seen the facility's energy readings, who'd examined the beacons and found technology that shouldn't exist. They knew she was telling the truth. The facility itself had changed after she emerged. The structure at the center of the clearing had sealed itself, becoming inert, impenetrable to any tools the response teams brought. The beacons scattered throughout the clearing showed no activity. Whatever had happened below ground was beyond their reach now. But Cambria's emergency beacon had done its job. The authorities knew about the site, had it under constant surveillance. If anything changed, if the facility reactivated, they'd know immediately. Deputy Rourke had been among the first responders, and he'd stayed with her through the initial chaos. Now driving her back to Pinehaven, he finally asked the question he'd been holding. Do you really think they'll come back? All those people? Yes, I do. Cambria looked out the window at the familiar mountains. They weren't taken against their will in the end. They chose to stay, to help build something new. That matters. And the positioned? Dr. Webb and the others? Still down there, I assume, making their own choices about whether to help or hinder what's happening. She thought about Webb's resigned expression, Stephanie's conflicted loyalty. They meant well in their way. They just couldn't see past their need to control everything. Rourke dropped her at Vernon's store. The whole town had heard about the incident. Rescue helicopters, federal agents, something big happening in the mountains. But the official story was vague, deliberately so. A hiker lost in the wilderness, a false alarm, nothing to worry about. Vernon looked up as she entered, his weathered face showing relief. Heard you had some trouble up there. Nothing I couldn't handle, she managed to smile. But I need to talk to Mrs. Kowalski. Is she at home? She's at the church. Been spending a lot of time there lately, praying for Hamilton's family. Vernon studied her. You find anything in your research? Anything that might help? I did. And I think I have some news that will help a lot of families. Mrs. Kowalski was arranging flowers on the altar when Cambria found her. The elderly woman turned, her kind eyes filling with tears when she saw who it was. Cambria, thank God you're safe. I heard about the rescue. I was so worried. Mrs. Kowalski, I need to tell you something about your husband. About Joseph. The widow sank into a pew, her hands trembling. You found him? He's alive. I saw him, spoke to him even. Cambria sat beside her. This is going to sound impossible, but please listen to everything before you react. She told the story as gently as she could. The facility, the pods, the beings who'd built it all. She told Mrs. Kowalski about seeing Joseph, about how he'd been preserved, how he would return in 6 months. 20 years, Mrs. Kowalski whispered. I waited 20 years and he's been sleeping, learning, being changed, yes. But he's still himself. He still remembers you, still wants to come home. He just has work to do first. The widow wept, and Cambria held her, letting her process everything. When the tears finally stopped, Mrs. Kowalski looked at her with something like wonder. Did he look well? Did he seem happy? He looked exactly as you probably remember him. And yes, he seemed at peace with what was happening. Over the following weeks, Cambria had similar conversations with Betty Briggs, with the families of the couple from 1951, with everyone who'd lost someone to the lake. Some believed her, some didn't, but all of them appreciated finally having answers, having hope that their loved ones might return. The federal government had classified most of the incident, but they couldn't suppress everything. News leaked out, strange energy readings in the mountains, unexplained phenomena, something happening that officials wouldn't discuss. Theories proliferated, but without proof, they remained just theories. Cambria returned to her cabin 6 weeks after the incident. It looked exactly as she'd left it, but everything felt different. She couldn't go back to her quiet life of prospecting and solitude, not after everything she'd learned. Deputy Rourke visited a few weeks later with news. The beacons at the lake, they've gone completely dormant. No energy signatures, no activity. Whatever was calling people to the water has stopped. Good. That's what I hoped would happen when I deactivated them. There's something else. He pulled out a folder. We've been tracking reports of people hearing strange sounds near other lakes, other wilderness areas. Not just in this region, across the country. Wherever those beacons were located, the network is shutting down. The system's complete. It doesn't need to collect anyone else. You sound certain about that. I am. The builders have what they need. People prepared to serve as bridges between our species. The rest is up to both sides now. 5 months later, on a cold morning in early spring, Cambria was working in her garden when she felt it. A change in the air, a subtle shift in pressure. She looked toward the lake and saw light, brilliant and otherworldly, emanating from where the container had once sat. She grabbed her coat and ran down the trail, arriving at the shore just as the light began to fade. And standing there looking around in wonder and confusion were people, Hamilton Briggs, looking exactly as he had the day he disappeared, but with something different in his eyes, a depth of knowledge that hadn't been there before. Joseph Kowalski, who'd been gone 20 years but appeared not a day older. Alice Drummond, who'd vanished 14 years ago and now stood on the shore with tears streaming down her face. All of them, all 847, returned to the locations where they'd been collected. Hamilton saw Cambria and smiled. "You did it. You freed us and still let us complete what we started. Thank you. How much do you remember?" "Everything. The facility, the beings, the training. We spent 6 months learning how to communicate between species, how to help both sides understand each other. And now," he looked around at the others, "now we get to do that work. We get to help humanity prepare for what's coming. What is coming? Contact. Real official contact. In about 5 years, they'll reveal themselves openly. By then, we'll have helped prepare the world, made sure humanity's ready." He touched her shoulder. "You'll be part of that too if you want. They specifically asked about you, said your independence, your willingness to act even when you didn't fully understand the consequences. That's exactly the kind of spirit they value." Cambria looked at the people gathering on the shore, reuniting with families who'd been called to meet them, beginning the process of reintegrating into a world that had changed in their absence. This was what she'd fought for. Not perfect understanding, not complete control, but freedom and choice and the chance to do meaningful work. "I'll help," she said. "However I can." Over the following months, she worked with Hamilton, Alice, and others who'd been collected and returned. They shared what they'd learned, helped document the experience, prepared humanity as best they could for eventual contact. Mrs. Kowalski and Joseph had a second wedding, renewing vows that had never really broken. Betty Briggs welcomed her husband home with joy and questions and love. Families across the country were reunited with people they'd thought lost forever. The positioned disbanded. Dr. Webb and the others who'd maintained the network for so long found themselves obsolete. Their secrets revealed, their control ended. Some faced prosecution for the kidnappings they'd facilitated. Others, like Stephanie, chose to help with the transition. Using their knowledge to smooth the path forward, Cambria's cabin became a meeting place, a refuge where the returned could gather and share experiences. She documented everything, wrote extensive accounts of what had happened, prepared humanity's first comprehensive contact protocols based on what the 847 had learned. The compass she'd found still sat on her workbench, though its needle no longer pointed anywhere. The light source had dimmed, its purpose complete. The journals remained hidden under the floorboard, evidence of what had been, what had changed, what was coming. On quiet evenings, she'd sit on her porch and look down at the lake. It was peaceful again, just water and sky and mountains. But she knew what it had been, what it had facilitated, what it had cost and what it had given. Sometimes the things we find in the quiet places change us forever. She'd been changed by finding that container, by following the mystery to its source, by choosing to act even when the consequences were uncertain. And sometimes, if we're lucky, the changes lead to something better than what came before. Not perfect, not easy, but meaningful in ways we couldn't have imagined when we started. The lake reflected the sunset, turning gold and orange and finally deep purple as darkness came. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, new opportunities to help bridge the gap between humanity and something greater. But for tonight, she was home, at peace, Grateful for the journey that had brought her here and ready for whatever came next, the compass sat silent on her workbench, its work complete. But Cambria's work had just begun, and she faced it with the same quiet determination she'd brought to every challenge in these mountains, one careful step at a time, trusting her judgment, following the truth wherever it led.